Welcome to another episode of the brand called You, a podcast and podcast show that brings you leadership lessons, knowledge, experience, and wisdom from thousands of successful individuals from around the world. I'm your host, Ashutosh Garg, and today I'm delighted to welcome an expert in intimacy and relationships from Hong Kong, Mary Foxworth. Mary, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you. Mary is the founder of the Foxworth Institute, which has a mission to bridge critical gaps in intimacy, relationships, and sexual health education. So, Mary, my first question for you is what inspired your shift from corporate banking to the world of intimacy and relationships?
Yeah. Yeah, that's a great question. And I often get asked that because it's not a usual pivot.
Mm-hmm.
I'd say that there were a number of pull factors.
Mm-hmm.
I definitely felt that I had a passion to learn more and contribute to being in the space of intimacy and relationships.
Mm-hmm.
And I felt that I had been working in an environment where that, there's lots of different ways to approach this,
Mm-hmm.
but working in corporate banking, it's becoming increasingly automated
Mm-hmm.
and without a lot of human connection. And I really felt that impacted me and how I interacted with other people.
Mm.
And it was also during the pandemic that I decided to make this shift,
Right.
which was when a lot of people were working from home.
Mm-hmm.
We were really losing these authentic human connections.
Right.
And I could see the impact that was having on people's relationships, their mental health, their general well-being.
Mm-hmm.
And it just made me think that not only is this an area that is so crucial to being a human being
Mm-hmm.
in a healthy and vibrant way, that there are also a lot of gaps. And
Mm-hmm.
when I say gaps, I mean the intersectionality approach
Yeah.
to intimacy and relationships
Yeah.
is largely missing.
Mm-hmm.
So I also felt like there was an area that I felt like I could have an impact in by virtue of my own interests and experiences. And yeah, I felt like I've done my time
Mm-hmm.
with
Absolutely.
corporate, and
Mm-hmm.
I learned a lot. I learned a lot of the foundational elements that you need to be an entrepreneur,
Correct.
to have a business mindset.
Mm.
And so I felt like I could take those lessons with me.
Mm. Well said.
So yeah, there's a long,
Yeah, yeah,
long
well
answer
said.
there,
Well
but
said. But tell me, what
yeah,
challenges did you
yeah,
face while establishing your voice in a field that often remains under discussed?
lots of challenges. It's
I can imagine.
hard to know where to start. I yeah, I think by virtue of living in Hong Kong and really understanding the cultural nuances when
Mm-hmm.
it comes to speaking openly about sexual health and intimacy and relationships,
Mm-hmm.
my biggest challenge was firstly to build the community, especially
Mm-hmm.
because I'm a bit of a lone ranger. I
Mm-hmm.
think there's maybe less than a handful of other people who are openly advocates in this space
Mm-hmm.
in Hong Kong, and the region more broadly too. So
Mm-hmm.
I would say the biggest challenge for me was to normalize these conversations within the culture that I live,
Mm-hmm.
where this is not common. And that was a good challenge though, because
Mm-hmm.
it really pushed me to be a proud advocate.
Mm-hmm.
And you need to have someone who is confident to have these conversations. Otherwise, no one's going to show up or no
Correct.
one's going to join your community
Mm-hmm.
if you are not a strong leader.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, there's just a few things there,
Very
but I feel
interesting.
like now
Yeah,
it's been a few yeah, I've had a bit more time to build that,
absolutely.
and I think it's just consistently showing up.
Mm-hmm.
People are starting to gather and to take interest, and yeah, so it's had a nice
Fascinating.
sort of
Yeah.
flow on
So let's talk
effect.
about the
Yeah,
Foxworth Institute now,
yeah.
Mary. Tell me about the Institute and what core gaps in relationship and sexual health education did you identify before you launched your institute?
Yes. So Foxworth Institute is dedicated to empowering diverse individuals and relationships with
Mm-hmm.
intimacy and sexual health education.
Mm-hmm.
And when I say diverse, this is where we are bridging those gaps that I've identified in terms of neurodivergent
Mm-hmm.
experiences. So people who are growing up ADHD, with autism, with
Mm-hmm.
bipolar, who haven't really been able to access education
Mm-hmm.
to really give them the tools and skills that they need to understand what their challenges might be.
Mm-hmm.
Might be, huge disclaimer, everyone is
Yeah.
different.
Mm-hmm.
But according to research, what are some of the challenges they might have, and
Mm-hmm.
how can they overcome them in a relationship?
Mm-hmm.
And so, neurodivergent experiences is a huge theme for us
Mm-hmm.
that we are tackling. Also, hormonal. So, I noticed as well, obviously, being a woman and more connected to women's health, there are also huge knowledge gaps with menopause.
Mm-hmm.
Also, just speaking firsthand with my mother and with my family members, and how none of this education around sexual health and intimacy was afforded to them, but
Mm-hmm.
also with men. And I don't know if this is something that you might be able to speak to or agree with, but
Mm-hmm.
there's also a huge knowledge gap when it comes to male bodies,
Absolutely right.
especially as they age too,
Mm-hmm.
and what to expect,
Correct.
and how to handle those hormonal transitions.
Yeah.
So there's another hormonal gap.
Yeah.
And then the third one is pre and postnatal,
Mm-hmm.
which I think is the closest to me in terms of my direct experiences now, because
Mm-hmm.
I'm 38 weeks pregnant.
Wow. Mm.
So not only do I have the research, but I also have firsthand experience, which is
Mm.
really sort of pushing me to get this education out there.
Absolutely.
Um, because as
But
well,
mm.
many healthcare providers are not trained to
Mm.
address
Mm.
these more
Mm.
sensitive personal challenges. And so, yeah, there are just so many gaps there.
Yeah.
And then the last one is mental well-being.
Mm.
And for this, we're specializing in how trauma impacts intimacy and relationships. But given that that is definitely a knowledge gap for me in terms of my
Mm.
expertise, I have actually onboarded a psychotherapist to deliver that training. So
Mm.
yeah, they're just a
Yeah.
few,
Yeah. Yeah. Very
but we
interesting.
definitely we want to. Yeah, there's a
Yeah.
lot more that
I'm
needs to be
sure.
tackled,
Mm-hmm.
but these are the key themes that we're
Very
starting with.
interesting. Yeah. But tell me
Yeah, yeah.
what does inclusive sex and relationship education mean to you? And how does it manifest in your programs?
Yeah, great question. So I think inclusive is a very broad term, right? So, but it's a very positive and powerful term.
Mm.
So inclusive means we are definitely mindful of making sure that you can access this education as an individual, in a
Mm.
relationship, in a same-sex relationship, in a heterosexual relationship,
Mm.
and we will do our best to make sure that anyone feels welcome regardless of their sexual orientation,
Mm.
gender, or relationship
Mm.
status.
Mm.
And to that end, we also include whatever research we can
Mm.
that caters to these demographics.
Right.
And unfortunately, I would say that at the moment, this is limited because human sexuality research
Mm.
heavily focuses on a heterosexual
Yeah.
relationship.
Yeah.
So there's only so much we can do to offer research backed
Mm.
information, but we can make sure that we design a course in a
Mm.
way that the language is inclusive. So we try not to refer to specific genders where we
Yeah.
can. Sometimes it's a little bit more challenging. For
Mm.
instance, with menopause,
Mm.
we're more clearly focusing on women's health,
Yeah.
but we would include language so that it doesn't matter if you're trans, for instance, but you still have female anatomy.
Mm. Mm.
So
Yeah.
yeah, so that's sort of how we're trying to navigate our inclusive
Very
approach.
interesting.
And then,
Very
of
interesting.
course, on top of that, there's also the inclusive in terms of catering to neurodivergent brains,
Mm.
and yeah, just making sure that the intersectionality is there, also from a cultural perspective too.
Mm.
So there's a lot
I'm
to
sure.
unpack when we talk
I'm
about
sure. I'm
inclusivity,
sure.
and I'm glad that you asked that question too, because sometimes I think the word is a little overused
Absolutely.
without actually being challenged.
Correct.
So
Correct.
I appreciate that.
Thank you. But tell me,
Yeah,
based on
yeah.
the work that you do with so many adults, what are some
Mm.
common misconceptions about intimacy that you have encountered?
That's a really good question. So I've had the privilege of working one-on-one with clients, and I've been
Mhm.
doing that for several years, which is also how, I identified many of these gaps.
Mhm.
And I would say that a common misconception
Mhm.
from this field work is that many people conflate intimacy with sex or
Mhm.
intimacy with sexuality. But intimacy is so much broader than that.
Mhm.
And that becomes more important to raise awareness of if you are, for instance, an autistic individual,
Mhm.
and maybe the way that you communicate your romantic feelings with another person
Mhm.
doesn't fit into this kind of Hollywood romanticized
Yeah.
version of what intimacy should look like.
Mhm.
So there's a few different layers to that
Mhm.
in terms of the misconception, but definitely from the outset, just really trying to distinguish human sex is one thing, but
Mhm.
intimacy is much broader. It's
Absolutely.
very personal.
Mhm.
And it also depends on how your brain works and what you're comfortable with and what you feel safe doing.
Mhm.
And that has many nuances depending on how your brain
True.
works, your cultural background.
Yeah.
Um, and yeah, so there's lots to unpack there, but it's a good
Absolutely.
question.
Very well said. But since you mentioned cultural, it's a good segue to my next question. You live in a very multicultural city in Hong Kong, and the
Hmm.
understanding of intimacy and sexual wellness differs based on which culture you're in or you're from.
Yes,
How
absolutely.
do you tailor your content for diverse communities with various cultural norms and expectations?
That is a good question. And I would say that that's probably been the most challenging thing for
Hmm.
me. So I'm Australian,
Hmm.
and I'm very much aware that I have my own cultural beliefs and understandings
Yeah.
of what a healthy relationship can look like.
Hmm.
And, and so, in trying to be culturally sensitive to being in Hong Kong and wanting to be able to connect with Hong Kongers as well as the broader Asia Pacific
Yeah.
region, which in
Hmm.
and of itself has many different cultures,
Correct.
I try to make sure that the way that I can transcend these cultures
Hmm.
is to ensure that I don't include my own opinion. I don't try to, you know, embed my thoughts and opinions
Hmm.
into our education. We rely on publicly available research
Right.
that, for many different reasons, doesn't get to the audience,
Hmm.
doesn't actually get to the target because
Hmm.
they're buried in research journals, or they're not easily accessible. And we're also not conditioned to proactively look for this information.
Hmm.
We're very much conditioned to suppress and try to figure it out in the dark. So in navigating the cultural nuances, I really just try to make sure that I'm aware of my own unconscious bias,
Hmm.
and I do my best not to impart that and
Hmm.
focus on research.
Hmm.
Yeah, but it's something I've had to think about a lot. Um,
Yeah.
Also
Yeah.
just in the way that I phrase
Hmm.
I phrase the education and try to make it as comfortable as possible, because if I was in Australia, maybe it would be a little bit different. I
Hmm.
think maybe I could be a bit more forward with some of the terminology,
Hmm.
but I don't want to scare people or intimidate people. And I want people to see the value in education
Yeah.
that is research backed.
Hmm.
And that's also important to avoid misconceptions. So
Hmm.
that's how
Absolutely.
I'm trying to navigate it.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And yet, there is the whole concept of misconception, and then there is the whole concept of misinformation. How do you address
Right.
misinformation around intimacy and sexuality, especially among young adults?
Yes, that's a really good question. And I think it's the young adult dynamic that's the most challenging,
Mm.
because 80% of young adults are finding their sexuality information online,
Yeah.
which is incredibly misleading and
Mm.
often leads to trying to find answers through pornography, which is really an inappropriate channel for this educational
Mm.
content.
Mm.
And so the best way that I can tackle this is, once again, just through making sure that the information I provide is
Mhm.
research backed,
Mm.
and also creating, like when I go to a school
Mhm.
for a talk, creating a safe space where young people can ask me questions
Mhm.
gives me the opportunity to really tackle misinformation.
Mm.
And that comes out in lots of different ways. But I feel like if you can create a bit of trust, then young people are more willing to really ask questions either face
Mm.
to face or through anonymous channels. Yeah.
Mm. Mm. Amazing.
Um, I would
Amazing.
say that that's,
Yeah.
yeah, I'm trying. It's tough though.
No, I can
There's a
imagine.
lot of
I can
misinformation
imagine.
out there.
I can imagine.
Yeah.
But you also
Yeah.
spoke about neurodiverse individuals. And I wanted to ask you, what steps do
Hmm.
you take to make sure that your services remain inclusive of neurodiverse and differently abled participants?
Yes. So to that end, we have our online courses, which are specifically tailored to the
Mm.
neurodivergent experiences.
Mhm.
So we're catering through specific courses for these individuals. And then also for our school education programs, which I'm still in consultation with other professionals to develop, but that will also be mindful of neurodivergent
Mm.
experiences too. So making sure that, again, you know, factoring in the dating experience
Mm.
for a neurodivergent person versus a neurotypical person, which
Mhm.
is not really a word that I love, but it
Yeah.
seems to be the
Yeah.
most straightforward.
Mm.
Um, yeah, just making sure that people understand what that can look like
Mm.
and really just be mindful that those differences are part of how our brain functions
Mm.
and is not a personal choice.
Mm.
So yeah, there's a few different ways that we're trying to tackle that. And I
Mm.
noticed you also said different physical
Yeah.
abilities. So this is the last sort of theme that I'm really keen to get stuck into.
Mhm.
And to that end, I had a conversation with a professor who's also a disability and sexuality advocate.
Mhm.
She's based in London, but she's a Hong Konger. So we plan to collaborate together to develop some education that's specifically for these communities.
Mhm. Mhm.
Um, but it's tough though, because with the e-learning, we record it in person, which
Mhm.
means that I'm very much limited by the community that I physically have
Yeah.
here.
Mhm.
So it's kind of been a process of actually finding these individuals who can advocate for and represent other communities that
Mhm.
I'm not the best suited person to
Yeah.
speak to.
Yeah.
And I found this person, which I'm excited about. So yeah, I'm hopeful that we'll also be able to cater to these
Hmm.
experiences as well, more specifically.
Very
Yeah,
interesting. Very
but
interesting.
it's a journey. It's all about building
Absolutely. I
community,
agree.
and
But my next question
yeah.
really is, how does your institute tackle topics of gender, sexuality, and identity in a respectful and inclusive manner?
That's a great question. So I think the way that we do that, which might differentiate from other institutions, is
Hmm.
that we're very honest with what these definitions mean. We're very welcoming in terms of creating a safe space where these terms can be used without fear, with
Hmm.
respect, and creating a space where people can ask questions about these terms, because I think a lot of young people in particular are seeing how these terms are becoming quite weaponized, particularly in the
Hmm.
US. There's
Hmm.
a lot of misinformation, there's a lot of hatred at the moment
Hmm.
within the gender space. And comparative to when you and I were growing up,
Hmm.
um, you know, a lot of these terms were very unfamiliar and were not
Hmm.
used.
Hmm.
So we also have quite a saturation of diverse genders and identities, which can be quite confusing.
Mm.
So what we do know statistically is that younger generations are much more open-minded to diverse sexualities, to the LGBTQIA spectrum of sexual orientation than older generations. But the gap is they are not receiving the education and support to navigate these spaces and to understand how to explore them safely. So that's where we're also aiming our education programs to address this gap too. So yeah, we try, but then, you know, there are challenges that come with trying to be
it is
open.
a topic that will have challenges, but I'm glad you're doing so many things. Mary, you have time for two more questions. What role does technology play in delivering your educational services?
Yeah, a huge role, a huge role. And that does come back to the culture where I was running workshops and I found that a lot of people were interested, but when push comes to shove, not a lot of people will physically turn up to self-identify.
Yeah.
And technology is a wonderful tool to give people a safe space to access learning and education so that they can discreetly and safely, in the comfort of their own home, listen and learn without actually having to be extremely vulnerable and self-identify. And even though I think vulnerability is powerful, it shouldn't have to be a prerequisite to access knowledge to really make a difference to someone's life. So technology for us is now a huge emphasis, which is why we've recorded our e-learning courses. Yeah, and I'm excited to see where that goes too, because it also means that the social impact can be a lot greater. People can access this who really need it from different parts of the world, and I can build community that way too, which is really nice, not just limited to where I physically live. And also I'll add that because I am having a baby, being you know, an entrepreneur and soon a mother means that having an online product can hopefully give me a bit more flexibility to be a parent and to actually care for my baby as well. So there's probably a few female founders out there who might connect with that, wanting that as well as part of their business strategy.
Well said. But on that note, Mary, I just want to say what a fabulous conversation this has been. You know, thank you so much for talking to me about a topic that is not often discussed. And clearly, the Foxworth Institute is bringing a lot of knowledge and understanding about topics in a culturally sensitive region where intimacy is not normally spoken about. Thank you again for speaking to me. Thank you for sharing with me such amazing thoughts on this topic. And all the very best to you, and all the very best to you for your baby as well.
Oh, thank you. Thank you so much for having me. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you. Thank you for listening to the Brand Called You videocast and podcast, a platform that brings you knowledge, experience, and wisdom of hundreds of successful individuals from around the world. Do visit our website www.tbcy.in to watch and listen to the stories of many more individuals. You can also follow us on YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Just search for the Brand Called You.